Hello and welcome. I'm Leslie Van Zandt, Chief Advancement Officer at WAMU. Thank you for joining us for the September Diane Rehm Book Club. This month's selection is James by Percival Everett. Based on the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, this best-selling novel has been longlisted for the National Book Award and shortlisted for the Booker Prize, the judges calling it a captivating response to Mark Twain's classic. Before today's conversation starts, a few reminders. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to use closed captioning, please click on the CC button, which is also found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Finally, like everything we do at WAMU, this book club would not be possible without your support. If you enjoy the discussion today, please consider making a gift online by visiting dianerehm.org/give. Let's get to the book. Joining Diane today for today's discussion of James are Dana Williams, Dean of the Graduate School and Professor of African American Literature at Howard University, Maureen Corrigan, book critic for NPR's Fresh Air and a distinguished professor of the practice in literary criticism at Georgetown University, and Matt Seybold, associate professor of American literature and Mark Twain Studies at Elmira College. He's also resident scholar at the Center for Mark Twain Studies and host of the American Vandal podcast. And now, here is our host, Diane Rehm.
Thank you, Leslie, and welcome to all of you. It's so great to see you and to be here with you to talk about what at least I believe is a fabulous book. The first question people have asked me when they heard we were doing James was, is it necessary to read Huckleberry Finn first? And I read it so long ago, I think it was somewhere deep in my brain. But Dana, what do you think?
I am teaching this book this semester, and I told my students there will be things that you get if you have read Huckleberry Finn. So there's that extra layer, but it'll be fine if you don't. So there was a little light, strong arm to convince them to read the classic. The beautiful thing of that too is it's an open access book at this point, so they can read it as a PDF. So my students have told me, I'm reading Huckleberry Finn for the first time. I can't wait to get to James. So I think you can get it without it, but there are some extra little nuggets that you will have at your disposal if you have read and can call it to memory, because I was like you, it didn't come back to me very quickly as easily as I thought.
Maureen, what do you think?
I agree with Dana, and I agree with you, Diane. I mean, I feel like Huck Finn is in our, I don't know, DNA as Americans if we've had, a kind of a more traditional high school curriculum. What's also surprising to me is having reread James in preparation for this conversation, it also becomes a different book as you reread it, not only in light of Huck Finn, but in light of itself, that it changes once you know certain relationships.
Interesting. How about you, Matt, as a Twain scholar? What's your view?
Well, I certainly would not be prescriptive. I think people should read we should read James, whether or not they have read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. But I do think the experience of reading the two novels together in any order is complementary to both. That there are things that Percival Everett is doing in James that I think I was able to appreciate as somebody who has not only read Huckleberry Finn dozens of times, but has read a whole range of criticism about Huckleberry Finn that goes back to the late 19th century. So that it definitely only made James more interesting to me, having that familiarity with Huckleberry Finn. But also, the amazing thing maybe I found about this novel, one of the most amazing things about Percival Everett's novel, was that I'm seeing Huckleberry Finn in a whole new light.
Of
Right?
course.
That there were things about this novel which I have taught dozens of times, which I feel almost, a kind of second nature relationship with, that have changed by virtue of what Percival Everett does with James. And that part I thought was just, a phenomenal achievement.
It was so interesting that Percival Everett himself said, Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is the source of my novel. I hope I have written a novel that Twain did not and also could not have written. I do not view the work as a corrective, but rather I see myself in conversation with Twain. What do you think of that comment, Maureen?
Yeah, I think, what bowled me over about James was that it wasn't simply almost, a literary gimmick where, and we've had those, where a minor character or a secondary character in a novel comes to the fore and is in the spotlight. I mean, this novel, it does stand on its own. It seems necessary. The language is phenomenal. And I thought about, the famous quote that Ernest Hemingway gave about Huck Finn, that all American literature starts with Huckleberry Finn. Well, I thought, well, yes, but there's some absolutely, this novel, James, made me hyper aware of the voices in America that were left out of Huckleberry Finn, or that Mark Twain couldn't quite hear. He filtered them a certain way. And I almost can't imagine, should I teach Huck Finn, I would absolutely feel not only that it was necessary, but that it would be a great pleasure to also teach James alongside it.
What did you think of Everett's quote, Matt?
Well, Everett's debt to Twain has been pretty well established for a long time. He frequently talks about Twain as one of the most influential writers upon him. He said that he borrowed from Twain in writing his first novel. There's a epigram from Twain to erasure. In pretty much every interview, he talks to some extent about Twain. So I was never particularly worried that it was going to, be a corrective or a gimmick, given how much anxiety of influence I think Everett has about Twain. But I think the one of the achievements of it is that it transported me back to a world which I felt a familiarity with, not necessarily a world that I enjoy returning to, right? But definitely a world that I feel a kind of kinship to. And yet so much about that world changes because we have this new voice, right? This new perspective, this new point of view through which to witness it. And I think that, that Everett, immersed himself in that world. I think he said that he read Huckleberry Finn back to back in succession, like 11 or 12 times before he started writing James.
Wow.
So he really had immersed himself in that world, but then he never returned to it once he had started writing. And so the novel becomes his own. It's operating in that world, it's immersed in that world, but Everett can do what he pleases because he's not trying to use Twain's text as a kind of key, as a guide, as a map, right? He's just living in that same world, operating in that same world, and bringing his own story to life.
Dana, there's a quote on page 21 as James is teaching a group of children, including his own, how to speak as they should speak to their masters, but how to speak in beautiful English at the same time. Would you read that for us, starting at the beginning of chapter 2 and going over to the bottom of page 22?
Sure. I'll say really quickly too, to the point that Matt was making about immersing himself, the way that Everett is able to get the language right. I'm going to do my best to recreate it here. I can remember one of my first scholarly papers I was reading, I'm a eager graduate student and I'm reading the dialect and someone said, "Oh my gosh, you do that very well." I said, "Well, I'm from the South." He said, "Well, we don't want you to do it too well. I think I can pull it off." That evening, I sat down with Lizzie and 6 other children in our cabin and gave a language lesson. These were indispensable. Safe movement through the world depended on mastery of language, fluency. The young ones sat on the packed dirt floor, and I was on one of our two homemade stools. The hole in the roof pulled the smoke from the fire that burned in the middle of the shack. "Papa, why do we have to learn this?" "White folks expect us to sound a certain way, and it can only help if we don't disappoint them," I said. "The only ones who suffer when they are made to feel inferior is us. Perhaps you should say when they don't feel superior, or I should say when they don't feel superior. So let's pause to review some of the basics." "Don't make eye contact," a boy said. "Right, Virgil." "Never speak first," a girl said. "That is correct, February," I said. Lizzie looked at the other children and then back at me. "Never address any subject directly when talking to another slave," she said. "What do we call that?" I asked. Together they said, "Signifying." "Excellent." They were happy with themselves, and I let that feeling linger. "Let's try some situational translations. Something extreme first. You're walking down the street and you see Mrs. Holliday is on fire. She's standing in her yard, her back to her house, unaware. How do you tell her?" "Fire, fire," January said. "Direct." "And that's almost correct," I said. The youngest of them, lean and tall, 5-year-old Rachel, said, "Lordy, miss 'em, look at them." "Perfect," I said. "Why is that correct?" Lizzie raised her hand. "Because we must let the whites be the ones who name the trouble." "And why is that?" I asked. February said, "Because they need to know everything before us, because they need to name everything." "Good, good. You all are really sharp today. Okay, let's imagine now that it's a grease fire. She's left the bacon unattended on the stove. Mrs. Holliday is about to throw some water on it. What do you say, Rachel?" Rachel paused. "Missums, that water gonna make it worse." "Of course, that's true, but what's the problem with that?" Virgil said. "You're telling her she's doing the wrong thing." I nodded. "So what should we say?" Lizzie looked at the ceiling and spoke while thinking it through. "Would you like for me to get some sand?" "Correct approach, but you didn't translate it." She nodded. "Oh, Lord, Mrs. Ma'am, you want for me to get some sand?" "Good."
Wow, what a passage. My question in all this, how did James learn to speak and write and read? That was the first thing that came to my mind. Matt?
Well, the answer he gives, and I think it's a answer that's persuasive and also has a great deal of precedent, is illicitly. Okay? The literacy is something that is off limits to most enslaved people, and in some states, in some settings, is literally illegal. And so he has to acquire this literacy illicitly, and he takes a rather extraordinary risks spending the time he does in the library of the master's home, right? And so we have literacy associated on the one hand with a kind of transgression, right, which I think is one way of thinking about literacy and education in the period of enslavement. But it's also, and this is something that there's a long tradition, including in the works of Frederick Douglass, it is also the source and site of power, right? And it is evident to James that that is the case, right? That's the reason why it's worth taking these extraordinary risks in order to acquire literacy, is because that control of language, that control of information, that's how one acquires power, both as an
Maureen,
individual and as a community.
Maureen,
I'm thinking as Matt is speaking, what a great choice of a novel this is for Banned Books Week. I mean, this is a novel that really speaks, yeah, to the power of language, to the power of access, and to what a obscenity it is to even have this idea of banned books in America.
indeed. Maureen, the first third of the book really speaks a lot in reflection of Huck Finn, but then it sort of veers off. How would you describe what Everett is doing in that last part?
Well, it does veer off, although I think of it more as intensifying this kind of fog-like atmosphere that I always associate with Huck Finn, and certainly Everett plays with that. I mean, people keep switching roles. So Jim is really freed, but he doesn't know it. He's still fearing that he's enslaved. And then Tom Sawyer comes along and plays this cruel joke, again, making Jim think that he's going to be sent back. And, people's identities are very amorphous in a certain way in this novel. Huck pretends to be a girl. Like, they keep switching all the time. It's a weird, the original and James, they're kind of a weird hall of mirrors plots going on here. But of course, at the very end, we have that traditional unmasking of a relationship that we weren't aware of throughout the novel, that in fact, James is Huck's father. And I love that, although I have heard from a lot of people who've read this novel, and even online in response to my review, why did Everett do that? I didn't like that. It felt, it didn't feel true. And I think that's the perfect 19th century ending, the mistaken identity plot. That's what I mean when you go back and reread James, it becomes another novel with that layer of information available.
Dana.
I love the point that you just made about the mistaken identity plot, because people not recognizing it necessarily as like this kind of 19th century holdover that Everett is playing with. And I must say, like, Everett's engagement with humor and satire and local color and all of the things that we know that Twain was very good at is on full display here, because there is the misrecognition, there are the Easter eggs where we get some clue that this is going to happen, but he's also working to undermine that abolitionist tradition and that 19th century literary tradition that Twain is writing in. So when we think about the emancipatory narrative or the slave narrative, it has this very specific audience. Here's what we're trying to do. We can't say things that are so harsh and so cruel because it may offend the reader, which is to some degree what that I don't like Huck being James's son is an offense to the reader that Everett is intentionally playing with. But you also have that kind of twist that's happening with the invisibility. Part of the reason that James can read is because for the most part, he's invisible to everybody. So the fact that he has been paying attention to everybody's lessons, and paying attention to everybody's thoughts and absorbing it and taking it in. And when he makes that recognition, which is a nod of sorts to Ralph Ellison and Invisible Man, is, wait a minute, they don't even see me. So I can pretend not to be aware, but even if I am there, they won't necessarily see me. And think about the fact that this 21st century book can say more people were probably literate than we had a sense. Between like 1870, the literacy rate was supposedly around 20%. By 1910, it was 70%.
Huh.
So the truth of how many people actually probably could read, and the kind of truth of the code switching that was happening, and the truth of the production of personality, both Black and white, is on display in this book in really interesting ways. I just appreciated that a lot with this book. So many things going on.
Here's a comment from Debbie. Consider that we have to suspend disbelief about being able to learn to read and write all by oneself. All of these unbelievable abilities shows what was and is lost when one is enslaved and not allowed to realize his full potential. So much was lost over the centuries by holding people back. And that's for sure, Matt.
Yeah, and I love the example of literacy and of education more broadly, because one of the things that we see change and shift from Twain's work to Everett's is that within the world that Twain gives us, oftentimes formal education is treated as a mode of indoctrination and control, right? That the schoolhouse scenes from particularly Adventures of Tom Sawyer are places where children are kind of controlled and are to some extent abused and afraid to go, right? And yet when we see James become a teacher in a somewhat analogous setting, it is a great utility, right? And a form of empowerment. It's a way of being able to read and, in fact, exact even a little bit of control on your environment.
Exactly.
Right? And so I love that shift, right, in how education is viewed by those who have power and how it's viewed by those who lack power.
Dana, what about Maureen's point about James telling Huck that he, James, is Huck's father?
I think it works in the text to make the point that race is constructed in ways that are even more unstable than we think. We see it with other characters as well. And we see it in the little use of the plot device of blackface minstrelsy, to say that there is a person who is actually of color, pretending to be white, who then pretends to be Black. It is the absurdity of these kind of racial constructions and parentage that I think Everett is trying to comment on, and to be clear that you can't always make those distinctions, not just with color, but with character as well. And to show how his thinking, James's thinking, is not a recent revelation, that the philosophical conversations that are all incredibly fascinating that happen with the dreams, but the philosophical conversation about freedom or the lack of freedom is more than abstract. This is also about biology and acknowledgement of biology and the risk that's necessary, and the willingness to debate within himself. What's my responsibility to tell him this when it will be a burden for him? So it adds, as a plot device, it just adds so many layers to the philosophical conversation, to the racial construction conversation, to the parentage conversation, to maternity and paternity and enslavement in ways that we haven't seen in, or that we didn't see in those books in the 19th century.
And of course, a number of people along this path that James and Huck are taking, a number of people question Huck Finn as to whether he is really white or whether he is Black. And we learn that James is a light-faced Negro. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there is that in there. And you felt fine about James telling Huck he was his father. Huck did not like his so-called father. He treated him so badly. So what was it, do you think, that disturbed people about James telling Huck he was his father?
I think as much as anything, people want the purity of the original. So the question that you led with, I think, was really important and really rich and good. People want to think about Huck Finn or James in relation to Huck Finn, not as a standalone, and they want the kind of purity of character. So the challenge of, well, why did you have to go and make Huck black? You can do everything else with the story, but to add some color to Huck Finn, which is ironic, of course, because so much of what Twain was doing was literally local color and trying to show those relationships between Black people and white people were fluid, but there had to be some limits on biology. I think for the discomfort is about the sanctity of who this great white character was supposed to be, and it should be frozen. You can mess with the book a little bit, but the character itself, it's a little more complicated. And I think that's classic Everett in the sense that I'm going to rope you in. I'm going to get you to like James. I'm going to get you to like Huck. I'm going to get you to like this book. Now, how serious about this are you?
Maureen?
Yeah, I agree. You know, all the time I was rereading James, I was thinking about another great 19th century text about the performance of race, and that's Herman Melville's Benito Cereno. And if anybody in this book club out there hasn't read it, it's a novella. It's brilliant. It's about a slave rebellion on a ship. And then the ship is boarded by an English captain who wants to see what's going on. And the enslaved people who've taken over the ship have to perform being enslaved again for a while in order to sort of fool the English captain and make their escape. That's a terrible plot summary, but there you go. I mean, it's that kind of idea of performing you know, if you've observed people closely enough, as James has observed, you know, Mrs. Watson and all of the white people in town, you can perform that role, you know, or you perform the role that you've been told by society that you are, you know. that's the flip side of it. Huck performs the white role because that's what he's been told he is.
And Matt, I know you want to add something, but we mustn't leave out the fact that James ran away because his owner had apparently decided she was going to sell him and separate him from his wife, his family. Family is such an important factor in his mind as he is going through all the travails that he experiences.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, to try to weave that with the question of the revelation of the genetic parentage, which, although family is the motivating force for James, particularly in the latter part of the novel, he is simultaneously, to some degree at least, abandoning Huck at the moment when he reveals their genetic connection. But I wanted to point out something, and this is, you know, something that comes with the question of whether one needs a relationship with Huck Finn in order to consider some aspects of James, is this question about the ambiguity of Huck's parentage exists in the source text, right? And in fact, in the 1990s, a critic by the name of Shelley Fisher Fishkin wrote a book titled "Was Huck Black?" And her argument in there is not necessarily that the literal parentage matters, but rather that in Huck's dialect, in the way that he relates to the world, there is evidence of the influence of enslaved people and African-American voices on both Huck, the character, and Twain, the novelist. Right? And so I think Everett is kind of literalizing a linguistic argument that has existed in critical interpretations of Huckleberry Finn for some time. And certainly when I read it, I wondered whether that literalization was necessary. But I found Dana's answer incredibly persuasive as to what it adds to make that question of not just acculturation, but also genetic parentage part of this mixing and passing and all of the the questions of the fictions of race. They are fictions that are both of culture and fictions of genetics.
What about that? By the way, I do want to say that I both read the book and then listened to it. I wanted to hear how it sounded, and it was magical to, after having read it, then to listen to it. It came alive in a different way than it did on the page. And especially that moment when James says he wants a pencil more than anything. And young George, who is also out and about as a slave, says, I will get it for you. Neither one imagining what the payment for that pencil is. That pencil is such an important part of this telling, Maureen.
Yeah, well, as we've been talking about the key, literacy being a key to freedom, so is writing. So the pencil is, symbolically the implement that allows James, I guess, in a sense, to write this story. I mean, no, it's very powerful. I think there's so many moments when I went back and reread James where I was just stopped, not only by what I hadn't seen the first time, but by the emotional power of the book. You're talking about family being so powerful, realizing the limits placed on James in terms of being able to help his son Huck to intervene, with Huck's when Huck's abusive father goes after him. There's that powerlessness that I think Everett does an amazing job of dramatizing here.
So we have that pencil as the beginning, Dana, of James's autobiography, if you will.
Yeah, we see Everett really touching on or writing himself into that tradition of the autobiography of the enslaved person. He follows the pattern to the letter, the I was born, how I will articulate myself, his clarity about writing himself into being and why that will make a difference, his commitment to the paper and to the pencil. So he's been a thinking person all along. He's been a person who could read, but he had not been the type of person who had been able to hold a pencil and then to put it to paper to make words for himself. And so that gives us a different level of the kind of enlightenment conversation about reason and
Yes.
about understanding of the self. His ability to do that makes it not feasible. I can't even get the language because he knows what the penalty is for George ultimately. And young George understands somehow. He says, there's this one thing I want. And young George says, I know what I can get and I know how I can get it for you. And even when they make eye contact, just as young George is being beaten, he tells him to run. So the sense that there is this community understanding of the power and the possibility of being able to write oneself into clarity and being is powerfully done here. Despite all of the slave narratives or narratives of emancipation that I've read, all of the kind of historical documentations, there's something about this fictionalized version when we see for the first time young George being put to death, really, because of this pencil. Because they understand theft, yes, but they understand what's possible. What does it mean for him to steal a pencil? Why would he even want it? The fear that attended it, that led to death, struck me as deeply emotional in a similar kind of way, where we see for the first time the depiction of the overseer's rape of the woman. And again, because in part 19th century just wouldn't allow it. It was, dear reader, this is too tender for your eyes and for your ears or for your thinking. So to have it written out, and to have it written out so beautifully in such a way that it was emotionally evocative, I thought was particularly touching as well. So I appreciate it, especially Maureen raising the emotional awareness that comes with this book as well.
Maureen, we've had more than 700 people sign up for this book club today, and many have asked Allison Brody, our producer, about the book you mentioned.
Oh, Herman Melville's Benito Cereno, Cereno.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's
I-
open access too. It's short novella and open access. You can get it for free on the internet.
Oh,
Yeah.
good.
And
They'll also recognize that point, Maureen, that I just like. So this is why, like, we nerd out when we're all in conversation with each other, the scholars and the book critics and Diane bringing us together. I just recognized when Judge Thatcher at the end of this book has to row himself. That's probably a nod to Benito Cereno. I missed that.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't think of that until you mentioned it, but you're absolutely right. And there's a fantastic narrative history by the historian Greg Grandin about the whole case, the true case that Benito Cereno is based on, that reads like a novel, and it is called The Empire of Necessity. It came out about 8 years ago, and it's a fantastic book. So
it's so wonderful to have such scholars, such readers on for such a discussion. I want to ask you, Matt, what about all the references to people like John Locke? What is that all about?
Well, it's something that I have been thinking about a lot. And I did not necessarily have a great answer, for much of the last 9 months or so since I originally read the book. One answer, the sort of simple answer, is that this is what a liberal education looks like in a 19th century Anglophone tradition. And that naturally, those would be some of the books one would find in an educated Southerner's library. But I increasingly think that James is to some extent a novel that's about the failings and flaws and inconsistencies in classical liberalism that are then both evident in and also encoded by American founding documents that are based upon that liberalism. And that one of the things that we're seeing in tension over the course of the novel is a kind of collectivist communal impulse that is focused on the shared protection of one another, and the liberal individualism that was an ideology in the roots of kind of America's formation that is still deeply influential today, but was certainly deeply influential in Twain's time. And I think one of the questions I keep coming back to is that there's a moment when he's talking to John Locke and he's got his arm in the catfish and he's about to be drowned and he's kind of seeing his life flash before his eyes. And that's a turning point in the moment. And we have this turning point in the novel. We have this disjunction, which we also have in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, between the last 12 chapters and everything that comes before it. And I find, upon reflecting on Everett's novel, that disjunction a little disorienting, also a little bit unsatisfying, that we turn from all of what Dana was saying earlier about how Everett is pinpointing in ways that few other novelists or writers have been able to, the power that comes from education, from literacy, from developing spheres of communication between people of like interests. And in the final 12 chapters, it becomes a revenge plot. And that kind of broad, macro, communal, collectivist narrative, it all becomes about James getting his family back, seeking revenge on those who have harmed him, and escaping to, the utopia of Iowa. But we lose to some extent in that, as satisfying as that is, as cathartic as that is, right? We lose some of the critique of individualism that we had seen in the earlier parts of the novel. Right?
He's also, in one sense, on at least one occasion, criticizing John Locke by saying, James said, I've been thinking about you. I've been pondering hypocrisy. Don't start up that with me now, he said. It was a job. After I wrote the Constitution for Barbados, the Carolinians asked me to write them one too, and I wrote it. James says, what you're saying is that if someone pays you enough, it's okay to abandon what you have claimed to understand as moral and right. And Locke says, when you put it that way, what do you think of all that, Maureen?
I think to go, I'm mulling over Matt's point.
Sure.
And I do find the ending supremely satisfying, that James has a chance to act as an individual, to light out for the territory, to have a future, which he doesn't really have in a way that we can discern in Huckleberry Finn. So I'm so pleased by how Everett gave him that gift, that I know what Matt is saying about that swerve that the novel takes, but I'm almost I'm forgiving of the complications that creates, because I'm so happy with what James ends up with.
How about you?
I hear the point. I think to think about the novel in continuity, or in parts 1, part 2, part 3, we see the end of part 1 or the end of part 2, where James is very self-reflexive, where he is having to make the decision about saving Norman or Huck. And his thought about it is, I felt I was in some poor philosopher's example. At that point, we see the shift from, this can't continue to be a philosophical conversation. This has to be real, acted out. I think when he has to choose Huck over Norman, he makes the decision that we got to move out of the abstract, because as we know, philosophers are doing jobs for money. Like, it's not a real kind of choice here. But then when we see him turn away from what I think you're seeing as the turn from individualism, I think it's a little more layered, because he does take everybody with him. He doesn't say, I'm just going to free my family. Part of his resistance to doing it sooner, the individualistic notion and the critique, is everybody in the community will be punished for my freedom. Whereas by the end of the book, he says, everybody who wants to be free, come go with me.
Come go with me.
So the critique of individualism is there, and the critique of the institution itself, like trying to negotiate the institution, which again is a philosophical conversation. Like, should I buy my people if I get free? Like, am I contributing to the moment of enslavement or the institution if I'm willing to purchase, or should I take them? So by the end, it's clear, I'm not going to try to buy them. I'm gonna free them and everybody else who is in this space. It's definitely a change in personality. We don't see that in James early enough. I would have liked to have seen it like a little bit more where we could see it. When he kills Hopkins, for instance, I'm shocked.
Really?
I was surprised. I thought, whoa, this isn't the guy we've known for the last however many pages. But after that, it's all bets off. I don't dispute that he's going to kill everybody, you know.
His rage had reached such a point by that moment. I was not surprised.
Yeah.
I thought
I thought that he was going to philosophize. I don't think that's a word. He was going to have a philosophical conversation with himself and pretend that what Thatcher thought was the case in the first place, that he was going to like, okay, I'll kill him, but then this will be easy to make it look like he drowned. He was like, no, I'm not even interested in the pretense. I want it to be clear that I'm capable of this. That I think was the part that was like,
Here is a question from Kathy. I love this book on so many levels. One of the more interesting topics for discussion is Jim becoming James. Your thoughts, Maureen?
Well, James grants the character more of a dignity, more of a formality. I mean, you're not using a diminutive of the name, and that's how I understood it. That's how he wants to be called. I mean, not that he gave himself the name, but that's a more adult version of his name, and he's not going to be treated as you know, as a boy, you know, or called a boy anymore.
Is it more of a white name for him to be called? You're shaking your head, Matt.
Well, to me, the first person who I think of when I hear the name James is James Baldwin.
Yeah.
And I do think that one can see the ending of Percival Everett's novel as in some ways a reflection of one of the theses that we associate with James Baldwin, right? That, you know, if some form of equity is not realized between the races in America, the outcome will be righteous violence. And
the fire next time.
And the fire next time. Exactly. And so, yeah, I mean, the question that I think Percival Everett raises, right, is that we talked earlier all about the power of the pencil, right? But in those final chapters, James puts down the pencil and he picks up the gun. And there is a kind of complication there about how far can the emancipatory and liberatory power of education and literacy take us, right? Or in the end, is violence, revolutionary violence, the necessary component to, you know, the changing of systemic inequality?
Wow.
Yeah, and the evocation of the Civil War at the end of the novel, I think, makes that very point, that violence is the only way that the slavery question can be answered. And we're also clear that it can't be answered definitively that way. I mean, the kind of racial discord and the contentious nature of all things in 2024 are extensions, if you will, of that kind of lost cause Civil War moment where you want to avoid the violence with the thinking, if you possibly can. But I thought especially bringing the war into the conversation at the end of the novel, helps us to see that there is an arms that has to be taken up to right an institution that disembodies people.
Maureen, here's a comment from Rhoda. Please spend some time discussing both novels' fiercely satiric treatment of the largely white American communities on shore.
Well, you know, I think to go back to that Hemingway statement about Twain's accomplishment, especially with language in Huck Finn, humor is the American voice, right? And humor is such a great vehicle for carrying social criticism. So both Mark Twain and Percival Everett use humor, use satire, use innuendo with a wink, wink, to get that social criticism across. And I think it's one of the strengths of both novels. I don't know. I never feel like I'm being lectured to. I feel like I'm being invited in, that I'm seeing things through James' point of view, and that what I'm seeing oftentimes are revelations and oftentimes make me ruefully laugh. So it's smart to entertain your readers as well as you offer them epiphanies.
I must say, I did not find the book as funny as some people did. I found it such a disturbing revelation of what was happening, described in such careful detail, that the satiric manner in which Everett handled the way white people behave and speak and treat others was so horrific that I found the whole novel so disturbing. Perhaps I put the humor aside. How did you feel, Matt?
Well, I would agree entirely with you. And I would say that not only about James, but I would say that about Adventures of Huckleberry Finn as well. I have failed to ever find it to be a funny novel. Not that Mark Twain isn't funny, not that Mark Twain doesn't have that capacity, and it's a huge part of his reputation. I think actually a part of his reputation that was consciously inflated during the 20th century, in part so that we would dismiss the darker, more political and anti-imperialist and sometimes even anti-American aspects to Twain's writing. So him being a humorist, being a funny man, is something that has a really long tradition in American politics and in American criticism, as a way of alleviating us from some of the things he's showing us that are violent and incoherent, right? That are disturbing. And that's certainly how I have always felt about Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Not that there isn't, from both Twain and Everett, there is wit, there is irony, right? They know how to turn a phrase and make something out of it. But I don't think of these as humorous works, personally.
I appreciate that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dana.
I was just saying I appreciate the clarity. I think the parodies, I think, are just like sharp-witted, which I think is how people describe the humor. Like when we think about the King and the Duke and the absurdity of it.
Yeah.
And like they're kind of tall tales that keep building on one another, or the pretense for the revival meeting, the one-upsmanship, and similarly the minstrel shows, like the wit and the parody, I think is different from humor. And I'm curious whether or not thinking about local humor meant what we how we think about it now, like not ha ha, but like you see the sharp wit. Yeah, I appreciate that.
I think of it kind of a piece with something like Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal, like in an essay in which he's satirically suggesting that the Irish be eaten by the English colonizers, to get rid of this problem of all the people starving in Ireland, right? So it's like you're exaggerating something that really exists, a situation that really exists at like what you read at the top of the show, Diane, that language lesson, how to make white people feel comfortable with you, how to assure them that they're in charge. No, it's right. It's horrific because it's pulling the curtain away from the situation that really exists. But at the same time, he's doing it in a way where you're kind of in on the joke a little bit. I mean, maybe it's a wonderful device to make readers feel more comfortable, especially if the reader is white.
It was a beautifully read passage by Dana, I must say, but I wonder how historians might look back on what's happening today. Will they see that as funny? Will they see it as humorous to think about sending thousands of people out of this country? It sort of strikes me the same way. There's an evil beneath the humor. Perhaps, as you suggest, Maureen, helping to keep readers reading, to not make it so awful. But it is awful.
Yeah, or to just survive. You think about like CNN has a new comedy that's political that I think will be interesting, or say Saturday Night Live. Part of what I think the parodies on Saturday Night Live have done in 2024, from immigration to a Trump presidency and a Trump reelection and so on, I think you're right. The horror of it, it's a comic relief that isn't necessarily funny as much as it is a letting out of air to be able to catch your, to get up and fight again. Yeah.
What a fabulous discussion. Thank you all so much for being with us, Dana Williams, Maureen Corrigan, and you, Matt. Thank you all for such a great conversation. I hope to see you again.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of you who joined us today. We had more than 700 people sign up, and that speaks to the interest that this book has brought to the public. Our next meeting of the book club will be on Wednesday, October 30th. Join me, please, for a discussion of Playground, the new novel by Richard Powers. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Over Story. His new novel is titled Playground. I think you're going to love it. And before you leave, please take a second and fill out a short survey that's going to pop up on your screen. I want to say thank you to everyone here at WAMU who make these book clubs possible. And again, thanks to all of you for joining us. I hope to see you next month. I'm Diane Rehm.
Bye.